Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Rick Settersten. I'm the director of the Halliford Center for Healthy Children and Families and a professor in Human Development and Family Sciences here. And today, David Kerr, who's associate professor in psychology, and I have joined forces to turn our attention today to fathers. This is Oregon's Parenting Education Week, and we're hosting several events here this week, and this is the third and last event, I guess, that we're hosting here on campus. And I want to make the announcement that we are live streaming all of these events. They're part of our outreach efforts to also reach practitioners and policymakers who are out in the field. So I want to say also to that group out there that when we have the question and answer session, they can actually pose questions in a chat box that's part of the live streaming window. Okay. All right. So I want to open just with some comments about how fatherhood matters for men's lives. Fatherhood was a relatively ignored topic in the 70s and 80s, and in the 90s became kind of a hot topic and is now a well-established specialty. The focus then, as now, is still very much on how fatherhood matters for kids and how involved fathering and father presence matters for the development of kids and the lives of women. But more recently, our questions have sort of turned to what fatherhood might mean for men, for men's development, and for men's life course outcomes. And to begin exploring these ideas, a few years ago, I guest edited a special issue of Research in Human Development that was meant to start pushing forward that area. And at that very time, I also came to discover David Kerr, who just across campus in psychology was also wrestling with similar questions and launching some studies of his own. So we've come together today. David is going to tell us a little bit about what he's learned about the legacies of fatherhood in a 30-year longitudinal study that he's been associated with. And I'm going to just make some remarks today about the larger picture, about what the bigger base of scientific evidence, the emerging base of scientific evidence, tells us about how being a father, and especially an involved father, might matter for men. So I'm going to highlight basically 4 different areas, and one is just the matter of personal growth and identity. Whether through what's been described as a personal jolt or as a more gradual process of settling down, fatherhood can actually prompt men to become much less self-centered, more giving, to achieve a greater sense of direction, priorities, responsibility, and maturity. It can also lead men, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, to take fewer risks and to temper their lifestyles, with the growing realization that their behaviors and choices spread to kids and spouses. In this sense, fatherhood can take on what we might call a kind of turning point in the literature on the life course, that fatherhood can provoke, in some ways, a kind of restructuring of men's identities. That how they saw themselves before they were fathers is often remarkably different from how they begin to see themselves after they become fathers. And the growing perspective that the gains made with fatherhood far outweigh what was lost. And those gains are largely about meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. Another area under exploration really relates to social relationships. And here, as fathers begin to become more focused on family relationships, they may, in general, become more aware of the needs of others. This kind of transformation can improve the quality of fathers' relationships with their spouses, with their children, with extended family members, and even their larger social networks. It can strengthen their attachments to community and social institutions, especially the schools that their children attend or churches, if fatherhood also creates a kind of spiritual awakening, which has often been found. So women should take note of this, and that is that men often report that having a good relationship with their spouse is seen as the key to being a good father and co-parent. And men often talk about seeing their spouse as a kind of parenting coach, someone who pulls them off on the sidelines and gives them instruction about not only what they did, but what they could do better. Being a good father and co-parent, men say, really rests on having strong communication and openness in modeling a healthy relationship for kids. But as fathers deal with the pressures of providing, in particular, and finding the time and energy to be involved with children, many talk about how their marriages end up paying the price. As couples have limited time together, and as the challenges of parenting can really interfere with that relationship. In the area of friendships, too, the premium on family time leads men to report that they necessarily have less time to spend with friends. But it's not just about how much time they have with friends. The issue is often about who those friends are or can be. Fatherhood demands that men make better choices about friends, they say, and it's often at the insistence of wives who point out the need to, in some ways, knife off unsupportive and unhealthy relationships in an effort to build a much stronger and more cohesive and supportive network of friends who enable them in their roles as parents. On the matter of health and well-being, on balance, the limited research on the effects of fatherhood on psychological well-being and mental health is pretty positive. And it's probably driven by the personal growth, identity, and social relationships issues I've just talked about. But it does lead me to wonder whether some of the health benefits to marriage that are often so frequently touted in the literature now might actually be health benefits of involved fatherhood. Positive psychological health effects are much more often associated with co-residence and with having an intact relationship with mothers. Non-custodial fathers receive or experience a far more negative set of symptoms, some of which may reflect the circumstances that lead them to live apart from their families in the first place. Some of these symptoms may also change over time, so that, for example, you can imagine that as fathers are making the transition to first-time or subsequent fatherhood, stress levels may be elevated, especially initially, both independent from, but also interactive with the stress levels of mothers. The role of fatherhood in men's physical health actually has barely been explored, and some have speculated that fathers will decrease their health risk behaviors, such as smoking, drinking, or involvement in high-risk sports or activities, therefore having a positive impact on health. Fathers may also talk of feeling compelled in a new way to get their health together for the sake of their children and for their own longevity. At the same time, fatherhood also, given the constraints on time, mean that there's less time to exercise and tend to your health, especially when children are young. And finally, I want to make a couple of comments about work. How might fatherhood impact men's employment and careers? So on the one hand, you could imagine, given the salience of the breadwinner role, we might expect fathers to have fatherhood to have strong positive effects, both on the likelihood of being employed and on the number of hours worked. And most evidence actually supports that hypothesis. On the other hand, you might also expect that fatherhood could have a negative effect on hours, especially if men are committed to involve fatherhood in ways that don't where work might threaten or jeopardize the kind of investments they're wanting to make in children. And there's some evidence for that, too. Work can enhance family life by bringing financial stability, and fatherhood can also enhance career development by the demands that fathers feel to be good providers. So there's a kind of interaction there. Yet surprisingly little is known about how fathers today, like mothers, might make hard choices about what work to do, how much to do it, and the costs at which those work demands might make on themselves and on their family life. So the more they work, the better they feel about their role as providers, but then the less they're actually available physically or emotionally for children. And this is just going to lead me to a kind of final question, and that is an emerging question in my mind about whether involved fatherhood is becoming a new privilege. So when you think about some of the most dramatic negative effects of family life in recent decades, many of them actually concern fatherhood. increases in divorce and non-marital childbearing have meant that the have increased the likelihood that fathers live apart from their biological children. Greater fluidity in unions has meant that that men have children with multiple partners, both inside and outside of marriage. Remarriage and cohabitation have brought step and other children into fathers' lives and further complicated their relationships with their own biological children. And in the sphere of work, I mean, we know that the position of men in the labor market has also continued to erode, and these changes have left many men unavailable to kind of fill the breadwinner role that emerged and became the hallmark of fatherhood in the last century. But the picture's not all negative. There are some positive things too. We know that there are new ideas about men and manhood today that have led many fathers to become more involved than previous generations in the everyday care and nurturing of children. And some of the same variability that I mentioned that puts men at risk also frees them from the constraints of tradition and in ways that bring the potential for new and more egalitarian relationships between men and women and new kinds of nurturing that can happen between men and kids. So good fathers actively care for children alongside work, right? But their role as providers is not necessarily reduced in response. And this is a strain that many men actually talk about today. They are expected to be active caregivers alongside providers, and they expect these things of themselves. But they're also continuing to recognize, often in acute and painful ways, that these are increasingly hard expectations to meet. And it is, as I said, leading me to a question about whether being a good dad today is actually a new privilege in today's world, and whether only a select set of fathers are able to actually enjoy its potential rewards. On that note, I will introduce David Kerr. David is, as I said before, assistant professor in the New School of Psychological Science here on campus. He's been here since 2000 and is also a research scientist at the Oregon Social Learning Center. And David is a clinical researcher and a licensed psychologist. He specializes especially in developmental studies of risk for depression, substance abuse, delinquency, and suicide. Nice light topics. And he received his Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan and also did a postdoctoral fellowship there before going to OSLC and then coming here. I'm so delighted to have David among us, and with that introduction, welcome, David. We've got to do a quick switcheroo with this mic.
Okay, well, thank you, Rick. That was just a great introduction and setting the stage. I'm really glad to be doing this talk with a sociologist. It helps put everything in context. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about this 30-year intergenerational study that's been going on in Oregon. And one thing that's really exciting about it to me, I need to stand over here, is that we present this work internationally and across the country. And, you know, sometimes people wonder, like, Oregon, like, are these guys really representative of people where I'm from? And here, you know, we're talking to Oregon, so I'm really excited about that. I want to acknowledge just the huge list of collaborators on this project. So Deborah Capaldi is the principal investigator on the studies that I'll be talking about. And then there are just many other people who have made use of these data, and really legions of assessors and data managers who have used these very complex data. And I was hoping that one of them would be here today. Alicia Miao is one of the HDFS doctoral students, and she's been with this study for a long time before coming to OSU. I, of course, want to acknowledge the ongoing support of NIH through a number of their institutes. Okay, so I want to give a couple contextual pieces, I suppose. This idea of missing fathers. I think about this phrase in maybe a different way than it's used in sociologically, is that I reflect on my own clinical work with children and families, and how I knew that there were fathers there somewhere in the picture, but they didn't come to the office. They weren't the ones that called to make the appointment. They were sometimes, often did come in for sessions, but if anyone was going to miss a session, it would be the dad, and often there were dads who were just nowhere to be seen. So men often seemed missing from the clinical work. And there's a long history of fathers being missing from research on child development and parenting when they're not the ones often who volunteer to be in a study. If they do participate, it can be considered like a bonus or like they're providing auxiliary data as opposed to like essential data. But we do know that that fathers are almost never actually missing. Okay, they really are there in their children's lives. And in fact, when they are missing from our research, it may mean that we're not really capturing the family very well because the factors that are associated with missingness are factors that affect kids. So they're not missing. Even when they are physically missing, they're still not missing because they impact their kids and their families through genes, through family risk context that they've helped establish and then left in their wake if they've left. And just the fact of their missingness has an impact on children's lives. And then also fathers are missing from our understanding of men's development, as Rick talked about. So I'll be touching on all of these today. One thread that will be woven throughout the talk is this theme of antisocial behavior. So when I talk about antisocial behavior, I'm talking about problem behavior, the violation of rules, laws, norms. And antisocial behavior is very intimately related to the transmission and development of problem behaviors across generations. Antisocial behavior seems to impact when guys become fathers and with whom they become fathers. It's associated with their low involvement, their coercive parenting strategies, and their absence. And it has an impact on child development directly and indirectly. Antisocial behavior is also affected by fatherhood, and that's I'll present some data on that in a bit, and by partner characteristics. Partners are often drawn to each other passively or actively because of commonalities in antisocial behavior, and they're not always good for each other and for their children. And then antisocial behavior moderates or influences whether father involvement is beneficial, and it can influence the effects of parenting interventions. So it's a really important, construct to be considering throughout. So I'm going to turn now to describing a couple of the studies that I'll be talking about, and they're related. So the first is this Oregon Youth Study. So this was a sample of 206 boys who were recruited in whole fourth grade classrooms from neighborhoods in the Eugene-Springfield area, neighborhoods in which there were elevated rates of juvenile delinquency. Okay, so the kids themselves did not have individual or family risk characteristics, but they were drawn from neighborhoods that seemed to put them at risk. Okay, so the boys and their families were recruited and then followed every year, or almost every year, from the ages of 9 to 38. So this is one of the really incredible things about this study, is that we often ask adults to tell us about how they were parented, or to tell us about their adolescence. And that's, sometimes we got to do that, but there are a lot of problems with retrospection about our past. And so in this study, we're able to not ask people about the past, we're able to actually have measured the past and see how it impacts the present. The participation rates are very strong in this study, so 94% or greater at every assessment wave. So that means the sample is not biased in that high-risk dads are not moving out of the study such that you have a progressively healthier sample, let's say, over time. So that's also very exciting. See, I can talk about all these things as exciting, and I can brag about it because I wasn't actually involved. And in fact, I'm the age of these guys. So the other really strong thing about this study is the emphasis on multiple forms of assessment. So we don't just ask the guys about their own behavior. We ask parents, teachers, partners, children about the guy's behavior. Collect official records such as DMV or arrest records. And then actually observe the guys in interactions with their parents and their children and their partners. So it's very exciting. So one of the things that has been studied well in this study is trying to identify what the predictors are of early fatherhood, so an early transition to fatherhood. And in this sample, we could think of age 20 as being kind of not a semi-arbitrary marker of early versus later transition to fatherhood. And in this study, these authors identified a number of family risk factors, all of which were found to increase risk for an earlier transition to fatherhood. They found that those factors did that in large part through encouraging the development of problem behaviors in the OIS boys during their adolescence. Antisocial behavior, associations with peers doing bad stuff, substance use, and doing poorly in school. And that those problems, in turn, were associated with early fathering through more proximal risk behaviors, such as health-risking sexual behaviors, poor condom use, multiple partners. So they found this really nice chain of associations here, but also found that some factors, such as early having a mother who was younger at the age of her first child, low SES and low academic functioning, were independently associated. So after accounting for all these other factors, they were independently associated with an increased risk for early fathering. Now, just some more detail about the characteristics of early fathers. So in this sample, guys who became fathers before age 20 versus after were compared, and we can see that they showed lower rates of high school graduation, higher rates of every substance except for alcohol, and much higher mean levels of juvenile arrests. So the upshot there is the highest risk boys are having children the earliest, and they're really starting their families of procreation at significant disadvantage. Okay. Bev Fagot and her collaborators at the Oregon Social Learning Center decided that these guys are having babies, and it would be a good idea to recruit those babies into a study. So the 3-generational study was born, and the goals of this study were to begin to estimate and describe the amount of continuity there is across generations in poor parenting and in antisocial behavior, and to then identify some of the mechanisms of continuity and discontinuity as a means of identifying potential intervention and prevention targets. So to date, 76% of the guys from OIS have had babies, and most of the eligible children have participated. So at present, we have almost 300 babies of the OIS guys who have participated at some point in the 3-generational study. This is the timeline of assessments that are used. So we caught them fairly early and then are studying them into adulthood. And so at present, we have kids who are at any of these stages being assessed. And we just got word that we were funded to continue to follow the kids into that transition to early adulthood, which we're, of course, very excited about. This study is very complicated and it requires a large staff and a lot of money because of the fact that it's challenging enough to follow a group of people repeatedly over time at developmentally sensitive periods. But these guys could be having babies at many, across a very wide range of their development. And so each of those children then need to be assessed in a developmentally sensitive way. And so what this means is that we have to have a staff that is always trained to do assessments geared toward various developmental levels, because kids could be coming in across this span in a given week. So that's challenging. So right now we have a lot of information about these 3 generations. Okay, and so generation 2 is focused on the Oregon Youth Study guy. Okay, and his partner, and he can have multiple partners. We also have data on his parents who were followed throughout his childhood and adolescence, and then we have data on his children with sometimes multiple women. Okay, so a first question that has been looked at in this data set is examining the influences on fathers' early parenting. And so the main question being, does Generation 1 parenting, G1 I'll be calling that, G1 parenting predict G2 parenting and G3 parenting? We measured and G3 behavior, So we measured poor parenting in a number of ways: self-reports, partner reports about the guy, and observer reports. We measured poor parenting of G2 when they were ages 9 to 13 in these areas: monitoring and supervision, relationships, inconsistent discipline. And then when the G3 were ages 16 to 30, we measured guys' harsh discipline, inconsistent and poor implementation of discipline, low confidence and low pleasure in parenting. So what we found here is that, so these are just correlations, unadjusted correlations, and what we found here is that G1 poor parenting, excuse me, that G1 poor parenting in late childhood is predictive of the G2 guys' poor parenting of their young children. And that G1 parenting is associated with G3's temperamental risk, so higher activity levels, low inhibitory control, factors that increase risk for externalizing and other problem behaviors. So this is really very interesting, and it makes us see really the intergenerational scope of behaviors in one generation. We're often thinking about how they're affecting the child immediately. We're not thinking about how it's affecting the grandchildren. So it really puts some of this prevention work in a much larger perspective. So we wanted to look at how those pathways were explained, and much of that pathway of intergenerational continuities in poor parenting was explained through the encouragement of antisocial behavior in the boys' adolescence, but also that some direct effects remain. So G1 parenting affects the the third generation by encouraging patterns of antisocial behavior that are associated with poor parenting, and through some direct associations, maybe through modeling or continued involvement as a grandparent, possibly. Okay. So this highlights the intergenerational legacy of poor parenting, antisocial behavior as a conduit of continuities, and the direct effects on men's parenting. We then wanted to understand some more about what might be explaining these associations over time. And so we asked whether G1 might affect G2 parenting by creating a risk context that puts men and their partners at risk for poor parenting. And the ways they might do that would be by encouraging adolescent antisocial behavior, an earlier transition to first fatherhood, and lower SES in the new family of procreation. But also that this risk context would be associated with the selection of a romantic partner who herself may have problematic characteristics that could contribute further to men's poor parenting. And that is indeed what we found here. So this figure shows us that G1 parenting has some direct effects on fathers' parenting of the G3 at age 2 to 3. But also some of the effects are mediated through the development of men's problem behavior, and what's not shown here is that this is highly associated with all these other things. So men that are more antisocial are more likely to have lower SES, to make a quicker transition to parenthood, and to partner with women who themselves also engage in poor and harsh discipline, and who have antisocial and other problem behaviors. And so a couple ways of looking at this figure. One is that G1 creates this, or helps create this risk context that then affects G2 and G3. Another way, and that includes selection of problematic partners. Another way to look at it, though, is that partners make independent contributions to father's parenting. And even though I've phrased this all in the negative, these are entirely consistent with partner characteristics that offset the transmission of problematic parenting. Okay, so I think I've said everything in this slide here. Okay. So we spend a lot of time focused on the negative and antisocial behavior because that's what we measured really well, and because we're clinicians and interested in prevention. But we also wanted to look at some positive pathways. What are some of the ways in which boys' positive adjustment might be a mechanism to more positive parenting outcomes, and also to look at whether men might be influenced by the characteristics of their children. So might men who have more difficult to manage toddlers, might their later parenting suffer because of it? So we measured G1 and G2 constructive parenting, which is comprised of higher monitoring, warmth and pleasure in parenting, more confident and efficacious discipline. We looked at G2 positive adjustment, and so this is not just this isn't just the lack of antisocial behavior. These are actually positive, attributes and skills. So academic skill, positive peer relations and social skills, competence. And then we measured G3 behavioral risk, both in terms of difficult temperament in the early childhood period, and then full-on externalizing behaviors in the middle childhood period. So externalizing behaviors would include things like inattention, aggression, defiance, oppositionality. Okay, so once again, we found these intergenerational associations, intergenerational continuities in this time constructive parenting, and that extended into the middle childhood years. So here we have men's parenting at with children of a developmental period that's similar to what was measured in G2. And we see that both of those paths are there. And we do see that, as we predicted, some of the effects of G1 constructive parenting on men's later parenting is by encouraging the development of positive adjustment that then has effects on men's constructive parenting when their children are in early childhood, and that then shows continuity to later periods. But that also there's this other independent effect, that G1 constructive parenting not only encourages early formation of good parenting, but also over and above continuities in that parenting, encourages still better parenting in the later years. Okay, and importantly, we found that these pathways were independent of an antisocial pathway. We found evidence that men's parenting in the early childhood period was associated with lower externalizing behaviors in the middle childhood period, but that the converse wasn't true. So more difficult temperament was not associated with worsening of parenting among these men. Okay, and I think I've touched on all that when I talked about the figure. Okay, so now we've talked about some of the influences on men's parenting, but now we're kind of going to look at it in another direction. How does the fact of parenthood affect men's behavior? Are men changed by the event of fatherhood? So, as Rick said, many men report that having a child is transformative, and it's a turning point in their lives. But actually measuring that prospectively and measuring important behavioral and health outcomes is surprisingly lacking in the literature. So we took advantage of the fact that we had been measuring these behaviors every year since the age of 12 to the mid-30s, so that we could plot individual men's trajectories of crime and substance use, and then note whether the event of fatherhood, which is highly idiosyncratic, could happen at any point for the men, caused or was associated with any kind of shift in the trajectory, downward shift or the shape of the trajectory. Okay, so why might fatherhood change men? Rick reviewed some of the background on that, but just to add a bit to that, you could think about these sort of push or pull theories. Are men sort of pushed and coerced by the oppressive, forces of the family, or might they be drawn to the role of fatherhood and motivated to shed incompatible lifestyles? And of course, both could be true. So the push theories come in large part from crime desistance literature, trying to understand why do men and women outgrow crime over time. And so social control theory captures the idea that when men enter into marriages and partnerships, they get pressure to conform to social norms. They get pressure from their families, from the law, from employers, and importantly from their partners. And that once you have a family, the costs of your misbehavior become much greater. I wish I could say things like costs of translating criminal propensities into action. I'm not as eloquent as that, so I quote it here. Another push theory is the theory of differential association in social learning that Rick also spoke about, that when fathers become fathers, particularly if they're involved, they begin spending more time among people and in social situations that do not support problem behavior. So primarily they spend a lot more time with women, and women show lower rates of crime and lower rates of substance use, and that has an effect on men. They also spend more time with other fathers and less time with non-fathers. They spend less time in bars, they spend more time with extended family, participating in community type events and employment. And none of those are particularly, encouraging of substance use and crime. Okay, some of the pull theories, really have to acknowledge that many men really want to become involved fathers, even in the absence of apparent pressures, and even when it is their absence is encouraged in a way. And so some see fatherhood as being a possible demonstration of masculinity, that men may embrace the traditional roles of breadwinning and protection as a demonstration of that. And some may embrace this ethic of generativity, supporting the next generation and being responsive to children's needs. And in all of these, then rejecting incompatible identities and behaviors. Okay, there might also be some push and pull that's specific to substance use. Men may be responsive to the messages about the negative effects of secondhand smoke on children. Women's substance use declines very dramatically when they become pregnant, and men spending time around those women may get some indirect benefit from that. And it also may be that caring for a young child and being involved is not so compatible with having a really crazy Friday night. That intoxication and the after effects of substance use may be kind of just incompatible with caring for a young child. Because of our design and our ability to look at when this transition happened, we also looked at fatherhood in developmental context. So might fatherhood mean something different for men who made the transition at a younger age than at an older age? And here by older age, we mean like 26 or like, 33, not older age. So you might, one might speculate that fatherhood might be a chance for a teenage guy who's engaged in a lot of problem behavior to take on adult roles. But most theory would speculate the opposite, that for young fathers, an off-time transition to fatherhood could be experienced as just one of many developmental failures and could actually entrench problem behavior and disconnection from the family. This ethic of generativity may not be developmentally appropriate for someone who's a teenager or a young adult. So putting someone else's needs ahead of your own is not really typical of, a teenage boy. The caretaking role may be viewed as a threat to masculinity, that it's, soft and tender as opposed to independent and strong. And it may be a threat to teenagers' newly acquired autonomy and independence from the family. So we looked at that question. So these were, as I was saying, the various ways that fatherhood might impact men's trajectories. A sudden shift or sort of a gradual shift in trajectory, or both could happen. And of course it could also happen that people get worse after fatherhood. So I'm just going to summarize the findings, then show you a few graphs that will kind of help you visualize this. So there are very powerful age trends, and there were very powerful protective effects of marriage that need to first be controlled for or accounted for before we look at fatherhood. And so we did that. And so the graphs I'll show you have that kind of partialed out, the fact that men will get better as they get older anyway. And so does fatherhood contribute something over and above that? So we did see that fatherhood was associated with decreases in self-reported crime, alcohol use, and tobacco use, not in arrests or marijuana use. And we did find that fatherhood at an older age was associated with greater decreases in crime, alcohol, and marijuana use. So it may be that as men are more traditionally aged when they make the transition, that they are more able to embrace those new identities. We did find a less pronounced decrease, however, in tobacco use. The older men were when they made the transition. That could have something to do with the addictive properties of tobacco, or could have something to do with the shape of the curve, and I'll show you that. So this is an example. I'm not supposed to, I can't use the pointer here. This is an example of, right here would be the expected trajectory of self-reported crime for our guys. Now, as I mentioned before, guys could be having babies at any time, so I just chose age 22 for illustration purposes. Here you can see this is the trajectory for married non-fathers. So you could see this pretty powerful level shift decrease in crime associated with marriage. But here you can also see among the married fathers that there's an additional shift downward and a change in trajectory towards greater deceleration over time. Okay, here's the curve for alcohol use. So the age trends are quite different, but there's still a protective effect of marriage, and then an additional level and trajectory change for married guys who became fathers. Okay, and here's a different kind of graph that shows trajectories of tobacco use, and this one illustrates the age effects. So here I have a hypothetical group of guys who made the transition to fatherhood at age 20 versus guys who made that transition 5 years later. And so here you can see that the trajectory among the early fathers is higher to begin with, but it's offset more by that transition than the older fathers. Okay, so this is how this was framed in the press. They were, excited about that. This is a way that you can tame your man, is have a baby, and I, wasn't in favor of that interpretation. Because it's not necessarily the case that these guys are now free of problems. I mean, they still may be committing crimes, still may be using, at high rates on these substances. But it does suggest, but the findings are consistent with the interpretation that there was a change following this transition to fatherhood. Now, this could have some prevention or intervention implications, that this period of first fatherhood or later fatherhood, but maybe especially first fatherhood, could be a window of opportunity for leveraging some naturally occurring motivations. So there are community-based programs that try to get across this idea of responsible fatherhood and defining fatherhood in a different way. And guys may be open to that message for a period of time. Motivational interviewing techniques may be used to try to highlight how men's current behavior is incompatible with future imagined self and family. Interventions to improve relationships with romantic partners or with non-partnered co-parenting or co-parents may be really important because men are more likely to remain involved and to benefit from fatherhood if they have a positive relationship with their romantic partner or ex. So I see these ideas as a way to impact both men's health, and that's also been demonstrated for divorced fathers, that more involvement with their children and greater sense of identity from fatherhood is associated with better health outcomes. So that's, a public health goal and a worthy goal in and of itself, but also that helping fathers will help their children and their families as well. So it's kind of a two-pronged benefit. So some general comments about these findings are that these studies support this web of influences over generations in how future fathers are parented. So I think that is worth pausing for a second. When you're parenting a boy, you're parenting a future father. That's a different way of looking at it. The developmental timing of fatherhood, father's problem behavior and positive adjustment, and father's poor parenting, all interconnected within and across generations. And so suggests that intervention can happen at lots of places, delaying fatherhood, involving fathers, supporting involved fathers, enhancing marital and co-parenting relationships. And I really like this quote here from developers of PMTO, Parent Management Training, the Oregon model. Strengthening parenting sets in motion an avalanche of enduring effects that generalize throughout and beyond the family. And I think these findings are consistent with that. So a couple just prevention ideas and suggestions could be aimed at improving fathers and stepfathers' parenting. So improving the parenting of fathers who are already very invested and involved. That would be one approach. And another is supporting involved dads who are kind of at risk for becoming uninvolved and how to keep them involved. So for that first point, training in positive parenting and non-coercive strategies, such as is accomplished with Triple P and PMTO Oregon, would be a good route for that. Also supporting the couple's relationship has trickle-down effects on the men's parenting. And actually both of those are mutually influential. So supporting men's parenting improves the marital relationship. Intervening on men's couples' relationships improves their parenting, and both affect the children. And then also attending to men's potential individual treatment needs for men who have depression or anxiety will be important, because it's difficult to be a good parent if you're not psychologically healthy yourself. So providing men with individual resources and stress management is important for improving their parenting. Okay, and then supporting involved dads and getting and keeping them involved is important. It is important to recognize that it's not always a great thing to have fathers involved. Some research suggests that some families are better off when highly antisocial and coercive fathers are not in the picture. But there is evidence that even antisocial parents, coercive parenting is responsive to parenting interventions. Enhancing the man's relationship with the child's mother, whether it be an ex or current partner, is probably the most important predictor of his involvement over time. So that's a place to put resources. And then social support interventions. So non-resident fathers, divorced fathers are more heavily reliant on support from friends and parents and new partners than divorced mothers are. And the support that men receive from quality confidants, as opposed to antisocial confidants, really does support their own problem solving, their functioning as parents, and outcomes of their children, as demonstrated in a recent article by OSLC's Dave DeGarmo. So thank you, and I have some time for questions and discussion.
Great, so let's just remind people who are watching online that they can submit questions in the chat box, and in the meantime, I'll go ahead and moderate. So,
oh, great.
Questions for David?
Just wondering, does the same behavior is elevated or reflected in sibling fathers, like an older sibling become a father or play the father
So you mean when a boy takes on the
Becomes the father of his younger brother.
of his younger brother? That would be a really interesting thing to look at. There is a separate part of the study that has looked at the other siblings and the effect they have on the men's own adjustment. But as far as I know, that hasn't been looked at about whether the men, model after their brothers. That's a really interesting idea. And I think actually that's an important part about recognizing the great heterogeneity in the great variance in families when you're working with individual families, is understanding how they're structured and who are the parents in the family. The mother is parenting, but maybe there's a sibling who's in a very important role that can't be ignored in order to help the family. Yeah.
Actually, for questions, I can say your name and where you're from on campus, just so we have a chance to get to know you. So,
I'm actually a creative with agriculture.
Oh, great. An interdisciplinary discussion.
I'm actually interested in crops.
Yeah.
So say your name again?
Hussein El-Nashar.
Hussein El-Nashar. Good to meet you. Thanks.
My name is Lee Lederer, and I'm an IRB coordinator. I had a question that when fathers become disengaged, is there any part of the assessment that looks at a male significant other that becomes re-engaged in terms of length of time and what impact that has on outcome measures?
Okay, so for the G3, when G2 men become disengaged, are there other G2 men or people in that generation who become engaged and help the child? That's a great question. I'm sure that happens. I don't think we're more focused on the focal father and his partner, and I think that would be an awesome place to have another study, but resources were aimed at the focal fathers. But then some of the work on that I presented at the end on parent management training that targets stepfathers is really important and does support that they can be helped to parent their child better, and that it enhances the child's outcomes. Yeah, thanks.
Question. Students in the room are planning dissertations. Great idea.
Yeah, that is. Yeah,
Other questions?
thanks.
Joy? I'm sorry, not Joy, Grace.
Hey, do you see a role for intervention between G1 and G2? Do you think that there is value in somehow repairing the relationship between the grandparents and the fathers, or some type of training that would kind of trickle down from G1 to G3?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, an excellent idea. I don't know about whether... I know there are interventions with grandparents, but I'm not up on that literature, but I think that's a great idea, and it really does connect with some of our findings here, such as this, that in addition to these sort of developmental pathways that help set up the men's behavior in risk context, the grandparents' past behavior does seem to still be influencing the present picture. And some of that might be that these people are still present here, and that they are either adding to the stress or they are decreasing it by supporting the men, continuing to model poor and positive parenting. So if we can't get rid of that association by identifying other predictors, then that would suggest that intervening with them could be a way of helping families. I think it also could be a way of helping men or influencing men in what kind of parent do they want to be and how do they get there. So what do they reflect back on what worked and what didn't, and how do they want to be the same and how do they want to be different. So I think that's a great idea.
Do we have anything online?
Yes. Can you... Well, they're just asking for you to repeat the question from them.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, so that question had to do with intervening with the G1 in order to help the G2 and the G3. Yeah, which is a great idea.
I'm Adrian, Center. And toward the end of your talk, you some thoughts on what people are finding successful in that regard?
So maybe you can answer the question.
So this relates to this question about that there's some guys that are involved, and there's some guys that are that they're involved and they're at risk for not being involved, or they're not involved. And so what are the ways of keeping people involved or pulling in people who are not as involved as they could be? So I think that's a great question. And I think one point is that I've picked up from working on this study is that there are a lot of men that it's not really a question of them being involved or not involved. There's much more gradations of involvement, and so many of them pop up every now and then, or they have some kind of relationship with the family, and so they are there to be contacted and to be drawn back in. Now, as for how to do that, I think one is convincing men that they do matter, that they aren't just auxiliary, that this role really does matter for their children, and that it really matters for their own health. Those could be messages that could be influential. And I think getting back to that point of things that could be done to, if not repair the co-parenting relationship, at least make it a co-parenting relationship, at least make it something where both parties can acknowledge that the other has something to offer, if they do, and try to enhance that relationship.
I'm Jen from the Nine-Ford Center. I know in the beginning you mentioned that the G2 sample was recruited from risky neighborhoods. I was just wondering if you collected data throughout on they're moving and what types of neighborhoods they're moving in and out of, and if that had an effect on it.
Yes, that's a good question. We didn't look at it in relation to their trajectories, and to my knowledge, I should repeat the question. Did we measure where the guys went over time in terms of the neighborhoods they were residing in and how risky they were, and whether that might have influenced their trajectories? So to my knowledge, we know where they have lived throughout their lives, and about 80% of the observations took place in Oregon. So the men were mainly living in the same area in which they were recruited. And someone could go and look at the neighborhood characteristics using, geocoding and those types of techniques. And I think that would be really interesting, because certainly it seems like there would be neighborhood factors that would support father involvement or make it really difficult. And particularly if they're living far away from their child, it's difficult to be involved. That's a good point in the dissertation idea. Yes.
Terrain for you to leave your mark.
Yeah, exactly.
Joy.
My question was, did you collect any data on G2 on economic factors in the men's lives, like abilities to maintain stable work, that might have correlated with their ability to father and also their ability to maintain those partnerships with their spouse?
Yes, great point. Did we measure socioeconomic factors, men's employment and employability and issues like that, and whether that affected their fatherhood and their their parenting and their relationships? And I think that one is addressed in part in this slide, that yes, the men's economic functioning or education and income and all that, stability of employment was measured repeatedly over time and characterized within various developmental periods, before fatherhood, after fatherhood. And those factors are highly related to their antisocial behaviors, their academic achievement, and highly related outcome to their early transition to fatherhood. So making that early transition makes all those struggles even more difficult, and did relate to their behavior and is controlled in these models. Yeah.
Okay, so just one more question.
Robert, I'm just a dad.
Me too.
My question is about the sample.
Yeah.
Just sort of thinking about the missing dads. Okay, so I don't know. One, is it were these participants paid? And two, how did you select the sample? And three, what is your opinion on the people that say didn't want to participate? How many of those that you inquired of didn't want to? So
In the very beginning.
Yeah. So the question had to do with recruitment and what the sample was like to begin with, and how it might actually not be representative potentially of a lot of fathers. I'm glad you raised that, because I was remembering that I neglected to say that this sample was very white, so more than 90% white, as reflective of the geographic area in which they were recruited at the time, and also that we focused in on heterosexual men and their partners. And so in those ways, this is not representative, potentially, of other races, ethnicities, in various situations. But it was representative of the regions in which they were recruited. And if you recall, they were recruited as 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds. So at that point, their decisions to not participate wouldn't have been due to them not wanting to be captured or evaluated as a father, or at that point no one knew they were even going to be studied as fathers. But it is still the case that people who did not participate, who were not recruited to begin with, may have differed in important ways from the rest of the sample. You also asked about whether they were paid. They definitely were paid, because they are participating in a very long and exhaustive set of assessments over time, and that is part of how they were retained over time, was they were paid for their involvement. Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you, David. What a great talk. We packed a lot in an hour.
Yeah, that's a lot of studies.
Thanks to all of you who are here and for your great questions, and for those of you who have been watching online. Feel free to linger, have conversation among yourselves and with David and me, and Denise, who's coordinated the week. And one thing is for David, if you're willing to wear it, we know you'll wear it.
Oh, yeah.
With great pride. It's from our college, not his. The College of Public Health and Human Sciences, a T-shirt and a portfolio, and then a Hallie Ford mug.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thanks.
Thank you.